chronologically, the novel begins. It's not the the very first section of the book, but chronologically, the novel begins with Josiah Chang leaving the Caribou in the north of British Columbia and arriving in what he thinks of as the great metropolis, which is Vancouver, British Columbia. And he is a little bit of a fish out of water. This environment is very different than what he's used to. It's very much the big city, but he's also feeling a certain thrum of excitement, to be in the great metropolis. And for me, the whole book really begins with just learning about the exploits of Chinese Canadians during the Second World War, and the fact that at the beginning of the war, Chinese Canadians weren't allowed to serve. Chinese Canadians, well, we should just remind ourselves that there was actually no such thing as Canadian citizenship per se at the time. Canadians were still British subjects, and Chinese Canadians, um, by and large, with rare exceptions, could not be British subjects. And the Canadian government was afraid that if they served during the Second World War, that would lead to citizenship in the franchise. So they were barred from the military. So when Josiah Chang arrives from the Caribou and he comes to the big city, he's not really particularly interested in serving or thinking about the war, but he needs a new vocation, and he decides to go to a shipyard. And this was also another way that Chinese Canadians served during the Second World War, is through wartime industries. And so that's sort of the setting, and that's sort of how the novel begins. Poppy's character, there's sort of a germ of her character in some of the reading I did about wartime shipyards. And, there were pretty strict rules about women in the yard and keeping their hair covered and protecting their modesty, and the separation of men and women, very often separation of lunchrooms and other kinds of spaces. But in the midst of all of this, gender segregation and rules about modesty, I read about this woman who sort of came out of some closed door in the shipyard and was shortly followed by a man coming out of the same door, and it was clear that something had happened. So there was this image of a woman who had had sex in the in the shipyard, and I just imagined what it must have been like to be a woman who was ahead of her time, sexually, who believed in her own sexual freedom. And there is something like that in the novel, something like that moment. It's one of the first times that Josiah sees Poppy, and that was really the spark for her character. And I often talk about how Poppy is the diminutive form of Penelope. She, of course, is famously, the wife to Odysseus, who's coming back from the Trojan War, kind of like Josiah. He goes to fight and he's trying to get back to Poppy. He's trying to get back to Poppy from the European theater of war. And in the Odyssey, Penelope is famously a faithful woman. That's her great virtue, what she's famous for. And but it also seemed perhaps to reduce women to a certain a single characteristic, right? And to value women for one thing and one thing only. And I thought, well, what if a woman were much more complicated than that? And wasn't that crazy about just sitting around waiting for a man to come back from war? And so all of that goes into the character of Poppy. It's of course challenging. You have to make two imaginary people fall in love, and you have to make the reader care about this. So obviously, they have to, um, there has to be some kind of immediacy, and there has to be some kind of deep feeling that the reader can understand. But the whole novel is structured around outside obstacles, to their relationship, be it the Canadian law or be it the father you just alluded to. There are external factors, but it was also important for me that their relationship and the obstacles they face not just be external, but also, that they have problems between them internally. And that's rooted in particular in one scene where Poppy wants to take Josiah to a cabaret in Chinatown, and Josiah is confused why she wants to go to Chinatown. And this produces, tension between them. You have to remember that the kinds of interracial relationships we might take for granted today. They were very, very novel in 1942, right? And so it's not just that people frequently frowned upon such relationships, but there isn't representation of that in the culture, and there aren't people necessarily to talk to say, "What was your experience?" This is very, very novel. So naturally, people who are involved in these kinds of relationships, they are avant-garde and they're going to experience problems. And so I wanted to capture that as well. When I, wrote, for example, the soldiers that Josiah serves with in the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, this wasn't something where I set out and mapped out all the characters and his friends and their arcs and stuff. It kind of just happened organically as I was writing, moment to moment, scene to scene. And certain characters emerged, sort of took center stage, um, um, commanded more attention. And I think two of the principals are Vandenberg and Walker, and both of them are two soldiers that I enjoyed writing because they just talked in certain ways and acted in certain ways that to me gave me kind of permission to be someone other than myself, and that's always fun. That's always fun.